What we're going to talk about today, if you've been following along in the book, which I haven't, so no judgment there. It is a hard book. You have to slog through it. And you know what's ironic about this book is in the back it's being sold as one of his most accessible books. And I just thought that was kind of funny. I was like, oh my goodness. So anyhow, if you have been following along, we were supposed to be in the part about Teresa of Avila, but if you came last week, you know that Mother Imogen covered Teresa of Avila, and the way that happened was I went into her office and I was like, oh my gosh, I got Teresa. I wish we could switch. And she said, okay. And so we switched. And the other reason that we switched was because the seventh chapter, the part that we're covering is called prayer and contemplation, ways to pray. And the seventh chapter was called Contemplation and Mission. And of course, I am the priest who's currently overseeing mission and outreach, so we thought, oh, that's a perfect fit, right? We're gonna talk about the work of contemplation and then how it leads us to do mission work out in the world and outreach work and, caring for those who are struggling and blah, blah, blah. And then I read this chapter, and I think it was misnamed. In fact, it's more about what we would call in the United States evangelism. Oh, that fun word that excites you so much. I can see everyone lighting up. They're like, yes, finally we're going to talk about evangelism. It's what you have been waiting for all these years as an Episcopalian. And just FYI, over the pond, they talk about evangelization. Not evangelism, and it has an S in it. So it took me a while. I was like, is that what they're talking about? They are. So a little bit of background about chapter 7, and we do have chapter 8 too, which is about praying with icons. So we'll see if we can get to it. What I'm going to ask you to do is interrupt me if you have questions or thoughts or something. Otherwise, I'm just going to drone on and try to get through the 2 chapters. But what this book is really, it's created out of a bunch of essays and lectures and talks and publications that Rowan Williams did. And he would have benefited from an editor because literally he took his talk for this chapter on mission and contemplation, and it was a talk that he gave to the Synod of the Roman Catholic Bishops. So he was invited to go speak to them in 2012, and there was no fixing it to make it more accessible to us, the popular audience who are going to read it. So it's just an address to the Synod Council of Bishops. So I thought some context would help about this particular synod. The Roman Catholic bishops in 2012, that was their 13th year of gathering. And so that was about 6 years ago, yeah? It was October 10th, actually, so it's almost exactly 6 years ago. And the seminar was focused on the new evangelization, or evangelism, for the transmission of the Christian faith. Rocking title. And it turned out that the day that synod started, where all the Roman Catholic bishops gathered together, was also the same day in the United States where the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life released some information indicating the major shift of markers of religious activity in the United States. First, they recognized that for the first time since they've been keeping track, the country was no longer majority Protestant. And the second thing that they recognized in 2012, so 6 years ago, 1 in 5 American adults claimed no religious affiliation, right? So the landscape of Christianity for sure, but the landscape of religious life has changed dramatically. And so the question is, what does evangelism look like today? So one of the things that I wanted to back up and sort of talk about is the word evangelism. Evangelism, what does it mean? Does anyone have an idea? Yeah, I'm going to give you the mic. Thank you so much, Eric.
Any takers?
You've got it.
No. I've been told
Yes.
that it comes from a Greek word which means good news.
Yes.
So to evangelize is to tell people that there's a fire sale on at Lowe's down the street, and you better get there while the prices are good.
Yes, exactly.
That's sharing good news.
Yeah.
And we're talking about a fire sale too.
Very fancy, Eric. Yes, exactly. Yeah, the Greek is euangelion, and the two pieces, eu is good, right? Eucharist, that's where that comes from. And angelion, that should sound familiar. Angelion is where we get the word angel. And it's an angel, an angel is a messenger, and so and angelion is the message. So it's a good message. It's a good message. And so the question is, what is the good message? And oftentimes the word euangelion, or the messenger, I have some good news, in ancient times, in the times of Jesus, was used specifically to speak about the emperor, right? So you'd have a messenger who would run from town to town. This is before social media, folks, right? And so he'd run from town to town and say, hear ye, and, undo the scroll and proclaim the good news. Now, for some, it was good news. Most of the time, it was like, the emperor's raising taxes, so he can build a bigger palace. So, good news is dependent on for whom. But the evangelist was successful not if people received the good news in the way that he was hoping, so not if people were joyful. The evangelist was successful when he or she shared the good news, right? So for you and I to understand what it means to be an evangelist is to understand, are we embracing our call to share the good news? And the Gospel of Mark helps us understand what the good news is about. Mark 1:1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Right? So our good news is completely and wholly defined by who Jesus is. So that's a little bit of a background on what evangelism can look like. But for Ron Williams, his real question is, in the 21st century, with the changing religious landscape, as I mentioned before, what does evangelism look like today? So he actually, he knew his audience. So he's talking to a bunch of Roman Catholic bishops, right? And he actually was the first non-Catholic who was invited to speak to that conference. So usually they don't let non-Catholics in. So it was a real sign of ecumenism and welcoming the other by letting Rowan Williams speak to the Synod of Bishops. And because he knew his audience, he immediately reminded them of the power of the work of the Second Vatican Council, which, as it turned out, from the day that he was speaking, was started 50 years ago to the day. So it was all very, fortuitous or important. And in the Second Vatican Council, there's lots of work that's been done. Most of it I don't know. And we can certainly, when Father Bill comes, ask him. I'm sure he knows all about it. But what was important was that there was some work done on what was called Christian anthropology. So Christian anthropology is how Christians see being human. What does it mean to be human? And previous to the Second Vatican Council, the Catholics really embraced the neo-scholastic movement. And the neo-scholastic movement basically had this understanding of humans that I would call a little dull, right? So what the Second Vatican Council did was introduced kind of mystery and paradox to what it means for you and me to be a human being. So what he helped them remember is this vision of how Jesus comes and redefines what it means to be human. So where's that mic? Where'd it go? Excellent. Can you hand it to an unsuspecting person so they can read the paragraph about Christian anthropology? Thank you.
If you'll tell us where it is.
Yes,
I was thinking.
it's on here. Yeah.
Okay.
Christian anthropology. To proclaim the gospel is to proclaim that it is at last possible to be properly human. Evangelism, old or new, must be rooted in a profound confidence that we, Christians, have a distinctive human destiny to show and share with the world. To be fully human is to be recreated in the image of Christ's humanity, and that humanity is the perfect human translation of the relationship of the eternal Son to the eternal Father, a relationship of loving and adoring self-giving, a pouring out of life towards the other, the selfless attention to the other that brings not death but life to the self.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And a very simple sentence, right, that made a lot of sense to everyone, but I needed to unpack it for myself. So let me tell you what I figured out it meant. What Ron Williams is saying is that with Christ, we have a new understanding of what it means to be fully human. And that is to say that our life is marked by the same kind of relationship, interaction, and community that Jesus had with God the Father and God the Son. So here, I think he's challenging us, and he's saying, you want to be fully human? Well, remember how Jesus was so intimately connected with God? And remember how there was an understanding that God's will was his will was God's will. There was no difference. That there was this kind of enjoyment of being with God. He would go off and just spend time, in the presence of the Father and the Spirit. And that peace, that wasn't limited to Jesus. In fact, it defines how you and I are supposed to be human. Now, I never, ever really thought that was what it meant to be a human being. And so I found this incredibly challenging. I don't think of my experience of communing with God as making me fully human, and yet that's exactly what the Second Vatican Council offered in an understanding of what it meant to be fully human. So does that make sense, by the way? Sort of? No? Sort of. Okay, all right. Let me attempt to try to, because everything hinges on this, unfortunately. If I were to ask you, well, what does it mean to be a human being, right? There's some common responses we would get, but what are some of the responses? What does it mean to be a human being? I mean, how do you know you're not a squirrel?
You're able to think, reason.
Yep, think and reason, make choices, you have freedom, can engage in relationships, can create, so on and so forth, right? You got that. All right? Those are the things that we usually recognize as what it means to be human. We can hurt one another. We can abuse one another. We can love one another. All those things are meant to be human. What Rowan Williams is saying is actually to be human is to be in communion with God. That your communion with God defines you as being fully human. Inasmuch as you're not participating in the communion with God, you are not embracing your full humanity. That Jesus, when he took on flesh and he became one of us, he was an example of how to live. And what did he do? He spent time with God. He would go away and speak to God. He would pray. He would participate in life with God. That's what made him human. Now, you don't have to buy into it, right? But I would ask you to sort of challenge yourself in wondering, when you go into that private place and you spend time with God, now whether it's in community or alone, but you are fully aware of the presence of God. That what he's saying is that is when you are fully yourself. Yeah? So it could push us in understanding another way to sort of be. All right, so given that, he then explains what he called contemplative humanity, and this is oh so much fun. So another unsuspecting person, please, Eric, to read that.
There are leaflets on the tables. Could help yourselves. Hold it about right there.
Okay. Contemplative humanity mimics the contemplative nature of Christ, that is, be open to all the fullness that the Father wishes to pour into our hearts. With our minds made still and ready to receive, with our self-generated fantasies about God and ourselves reduced to silence, we are at last at the point where we may begin to grow. And the face we need to show to our world is the face of a humanity in endless growth toward love, a humanity so delighted and engaged by the glory of what we look towards that we are prepared to embark on a journey without end to find our way more deeply into it, into the heart of the Trinitarian life.
Great, thank you so much. So what Williams is saying is as you embrace this vision of how to be fully human, what you end up doing is, and he uses the words gazing on God. As you gaze on God and you begin to engage in the work of being in relationship with God, in communion, in God's presence, all of a sudden, your problems, your selfish needs, your worry about your little world begins to dissipate. And what fills it is the Trinitarian life, the life of God, which is filled with joy, which is filled with a love, which is filled with mercy, which is filled with justice. And there's an understanding that you become less and less as you gaze upon God and spend time with God more and more. Does that make sense? Does anyone recognize this? Is anyone, okay, I see some heads nodding. Yeah, so again, when you spend the time in communion with God, you are all of a sudden, hey guys, can you close the door? Sorry, thank you so much. When you spend time in communion with God, you begin to be changed. And what changes about you is you. Your needs, your wants, your desires. And Ron Williams is kind of really insistent upon this. So he talks about our self-generated fantasies of who God is. Like God's the one who's going to take care of my needs, and God's going to... And instead, when you spend time with God, you begin to let go of those things. You are not the center. God becomes the center. And there's a couple things to remember about this, some notes I have for you. This isn't a private experience. So even though it sounds like you are having this individual experience with God, that you are being changed, Williams claims it's not private. It's not your own personal holiness. Now, how he makes this claim is simply to state it. And I don't know what to do with that, because I think that those of us who are attempting to engage in a relationship with God do have a sort of sense of personal nature to it. Yes, Chris. Father Chris has a...
So I agree with what you're pointing out here. I would add to that, though, that this business of contemplative prayer, spending time with God, reflecting on your relationship with God, is not the end result. Rather, it is what he states earlier, which is the self-giving pouring out of life towards the other. That is what flows from that contemplative life. And so he can state that, I think, because if you look at the life of Jesus, which we are called to follow, that was essentially what Jesus did, a pouring out of life towards the other. And, So I think by taking a pause in our life, by going out to the desert, by going on a retreat, by slowing down in our own home, if we have a little space that we can quiet down and do that kind of daily reflection. Where was God in my life today? Where did I miss out on God today? What was the opportunity that I was so busy, so wrapped up in my own agenda? Was I so late to that meeting that I didn't pull over to the side of the road and help that person whose car was stuck? Those are the moments we miss. And so contemplative prayer helps us to kind of slow down and reflect and catch them, but they're lived out in the outpouring of our own lives towards the other. It's not a mountaintop experience in my estimation.
Yes. Father Chris is absolutely right, and he's read the chapter, because that is where we end up, and most definitely. Yes, Eric.
I'd like to make a tiny add-on to that, and it's from, I think it was also on the printout, and I was really struck by the phrase in which Williams describes this contemplation of the other that brings life, not death. I stopped and I had to think about that, and I realized that my entire life, every waking and probably every sleeping moment, I'm operating on the supposition that mine is the one real life. And when I'm paying attention to other people, I briefly and kindly put my life on pause so that I can let them know I'm thinking about them, but then I go right back to the main show. And Williams is saying it's not about that at all. That everyone's life is the main show, God's supremely. But when I turn my life on heavy pause, it doesn't bring death. It starts to lead me into even deeper life. That's an astonishing idea.
Right. Those who want their life will lose it. Most certainly. I'm very grateful, because I think we're starting to understand what exactly Williams is trying to get across, which is our rugged self-individualism is actually harming our ability to be fully human. And because of that, these ways of living that are contemplative, that eventually turn to evangelism. We're going to make that turn, even though we've anticipated that already, that eventually turn outwards actually helps you become more of who you are. And that's the irony of it, right? Okay, let me point out a couple more notes on this. And I thought this was very helpful, and pointing to what Father Chris said. In the self-forgetting gazing on the light of God in Christ, we learn how to look at one another and at the whole of God's creation differently. And we learn what we need to be true and honest and loving towards one another. So, in other words, this isn't internal to you. You have a relationship with God, and it is your relationship with God that will actually help you then know how to be with other people. Now, I don't know if this rings true to you, but it rings true to me. Because what I recognize is when I'm working on myself, with my own self-thoughts and self-vision, I tend to become selfish. And I tend to think about things with my perspective. But when I go to God and I begin to hear what God is saying to me, how God is filled with love for everything and everybody, how God spent endless divine energy to create, to redeem, and to make sure that all have full life. It begins to change the way I look at things. And so then when I turn around from gazing on God and turn to my human beings and all of creation, I have different eyes. I look upon things, I experience things differently. And it requires both actions. You cannot look towards creation and people and the earth not having first turned towards God. That's a remarkable thing to say. It's a remarkable way of understanding our Christian life. And for me, actually what it did is it helped me understand why I come to church every week. Because I've been struggling in post-secular, in secular culture, post-Christian culture. Why come to church every week? And I know lots of people who participate in all kinds of activities that are very holy. Some of them are even through the church, but don't come to worship every week. And what we're saying and what we're learning is that if you're not in the presence of God, you cannot go out and live in that world fully as a human being. Judge? Hold on for the mic. Thank you.
One of the things I think about evangelists is that they feel they have an obligation to convert other people, whatever conversion means.
Yes.
And I guess the question I'm having is, can you have this presence with God and live like Christ wants us to live, the other part of the two things he's talking about here, and not be a Christian?
And not be a Christian.
In the sense that you won't accept the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, and etc.
Right. So once again, the question is what is your responsibility as an evangelist or as a Christian? I would argue that as a Christian, you're called to be evangelist, which I don't know how you feel about that, but you've been baptized so that you can go and share the good news with everyone. If you became a parent, it was hard to keep that news to yourself. Can you imagine if that was your responsibility? You became, or you found your beloved and you decided that was going to be, you found the one for life. And can you imagine if you weren't allowed to share it? You can't help but want to share these things. It's the same idea with being a Christian. You were baptized. God claimed you and said, you're going to be mine, and I'm going to show you the fullness of life today and for always, and you get to live into it for your life. And you want to be like, I need to go and share this good news of what God can do, right? But let me go through my little cheat sheet here on how to engage in contemplation and evangelism. Do you see that? I think it's on, page 2. Oh, yeah, okay. Amy, right over here.
Don't you think it's more of a personality type?
A personality who evangelizes?
Yeah, there's some, I mean, I know that the Bible
Some people who are
says all
charismatic,
prophets, or
right.
all apostles, or all
Right.
evangelists, or all
Yeah.
preachers and teachers, and so some people are kind of like have that grace on them.
Yeah, but there's this
maybe.
great line.
everyone's
I think it's in the
excited.
book of Acts, or maybe no, it must be in the Gospels, where Jesus, it is the Gospels. Jesus says to the disciples, he said, you know, you're going to be called forth, and you're going to have to witness to what you believe.
Right.
You might die after you do that, but you're going to be called. Don't prepare anything. The Holy Spirit will give you the words that you need. Now, for that to be true, what that tells me is that I've spent time with the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And I recognize the voice of the Holy Spirit. I recognize when God is working through me. And all of that, again, points to, in order to go and do the work of being a Christian out in this world, spend time with God. Spend time in God's community. Spend time gazing, forgetting about yourself. Disentangle selfish from objects that let go of yourself. Now, I find I'm stuck often on that first step. You all are better Christians, but that's difficult. And I would argue you don't do that by yourself. That in fact it is God who does that with you and for you. And so the good news for me is that there's no way I'm going to be able to do that by myself, but God intervenes. Disentangled yourself with silence and prayer. Now, the things that Rowan Williams lifted up. I would argue you can contemplate God through scriptures. You can contemplate God through music. You can contemplate God through all kinds of different ways that match who you are, the way God speaks to you. You can do this in community, and he actually recommends that you do it in communities that are different from you. So he points to the Taizé community, which is a Catholic community. So for us to go outside of our Episcopal roots and engage in contemplation with other communities. And the benefit of that is that you're seeing God then with different eyes, right? And I'm just going to be personal here right now. One of the gifts that you all, as Christ Church Cranbrook, have embraced is seeing God from a different pair of eyes that is from the Lutheran Church, right? And that's me. So I bring to this congregation a sensibility